Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., where we've just heard a fascinating panel discussion that included the Pentagon Industrial Base Chief. The topic, looking at the future of America's defense industrial base, which the Trump administration is studying from the White House level on down. We've got with us two guests who are going to be key, hopefully, in that debate. Retired United States Army Lieutenant General Tom Spoehr, who's the director of the National Defense Initiative, Research Initiative here at the Heritage Foundation, and Bill Greenwalt, who a lot of time on the Hill, but also very importantly, now at the Atlantic Council, but very importantly, one of the people who served in the position as the Pentagon's industrial base chief. General, I want to go to you first. What do you think some of the key takeaways are as Jerry McGinn, who's acting in that role over in the Pentagon now as the industrial policy chief, looks forward to his part of the study about sort of looking at the future of the American defense industrial base?
Right, and so President Trump has announced a rebuilding of the United States military. Well, that rebuilding cannot take place on a weak industrial base. And so we explored today some topics. We talked about the executive review that President Trump has directed. We looked at what are some of the aspects that we'd like to find in that executive review. And it was really a worthwhile panel from my perspective.
Bill, let me take it to you. What are sort of the key recommendations? You know, you sat in that job in the Bush administration and you did it. You guys are always doing a whole bunch of studies, whether it's about resiliency, whether or not there are enough manufacturers in any particular marketplace. You give a key voice both in the CFIUS process, but also in the merger and acquisition process. Tell us some of the recommendations that you recapped there for Jerry as he sat on that dais with you.
No, I think there are a number of things. One is that to increase resilience, you're going to need to actually put more money behind programs. You're going to need more programs, more competition. You need to look at not just our own internal defense industrial base, but the commercial civilian industrial base, which could help support defense and bring in new innovation and new ideas to our defense national strategy.
As we look at it, I mean, Rachel, who's on your staff, mentioned, you know, that there's a brittleness to the industrial base right now, and I think that most people would recognize that. But what we've done is nationally put a preference on fewer number of competitors, each one of those competitors to be healthier. That started with Bill Perry, although I think it's gone maybe a little bit farther than even Bill Perry. I think he's admitted to that farther than he ever imagined it to go. But the thing is, we want greater value, and basically from a national perspective, there is limits on defense spending that we want to spend. There are other national priorities we didn't have in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Talk to us a little bit about kind of a philosophical approach we need to take when we're looking at the U.S. defense industrial base, which is part of a global defense industrial chain, right? None of these guys can do the sorts of things that they could within our borders, for example, in the 1950s.
Yeah, and so as our panel discussed today, there is a conflict between cost and competitiveness. And so I still remember when we canceled the second engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. In retrospect, that doesn't look like such a good decision now when we are so dependent on one engine manufacturer for our only fighter aircraft. And so I think we have to look at all aspects before we go arrive at our acquisition strategy and look at the industrial base before we make a decision just based on cost alone.
Bill?
I agree, the same thing. We have to essentially have more competitors, more programs, and to do that requires putting additional resources behind it. If we don't put more resources behind it, we're going to continue to have a brittle industrial base and therefore won't be there when we need it in an emergency.
But let me ask you about the global resiliency issue. I mean, if you look at it, you know, even if you went back to the 1980s, the United States was still managing to build a lot of that stuff within its borders. When we got to the Bush administration at that point, we started to increasingly look beyond the nation's borders. You were there at a key time when we were trying to pull from global supply bases, whether it was for MRAPs, whether it was for plate armor, whether it was for bullets, whether it was for electronics, EW gear. A lot of it was you know, a lot of American lives were saved by that because our allies forked over some of their cutting edge technology. How do you do this in a context where we are dependent? You know, you mentioned warehousing. I mean, we don't warehouse all that much anymore. Everything is in just-in-time delivery, which then, for example, whether it's a Korea or a China scenario, we're going to be dependent on global supply chains that could be pinched. Talk to us about that global dimension and how best to deal with it when, even though, you know, we've struck security of supply relationships, some of those relationships could be under pressure.
No, I agree, and globalization is a reality, and frankly, when we start looking for innovation, there's a tremendous amount of innovation out there in our closest allies. There's a tremendous amount of innovation in the commercial sector, who primarily their entire supply chain is globalized. We have to look at our industrial-based planning in such a way to negate the potential harmful effects of that globalization, but take maximum advantage of it as possible. And that's going to be the key that this industrial-based executive order and this study are going to have to look at.
And let me ask you one last question, and that's about protectionism, which is what everybody fears. The original fears was that this was going to be a very, very protectionist exercise as opposed to one that is not going to be. What's the recommendation, sir, that each of you have in terms of the importance of making this non-protectionist?
Yeah, and so that is the fear of the Heritage Foundation in this endeavor. You can read the executive order and you can find some grounds to think that this may be an exercise in protectionism. We'd like not to see that because that drives up cost. We'd like to be able to rely on supply chains that are under the control of our reliable and trusted partners versus having to have everything located in the United States.
Bill?
The United States Department of Defense no longer drives global research and development. It cannot put up barriers to protectionism. It cannot put up barriers to bringing in the best and the brightest engineering talent to help solve our problems here in the United States as far as national defense goes. So putting up protectionist barriers would be not in our national security interests, and we have to prevent that from happening.
Bill Greenwalt of the Atlantic Council, Tom Spoehr of the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.